Nothing symbolizes true love more than classic red roses. Hi everyone, I'm happy that you were able to join me today for Alex Syberia's February release featuring Roses Frame. This gorgeous digital image has been done up as either a wedding or anniversary card, but really could be used for any occasion where you need to send best wishes. The image has been printed on Nina Classic Crest 80-pound cardstock. When working with digital images, I work primarily on my iPad. I download the image into a file, and then from there I transfer it back into my photos. I use an app called Print to Size, which allows me to access the image from my photos. I can then resize it to my liking and print it. The first thing that I did was color in the negative space in the center of the image using a Copic marker number 100 black. It isn't completely black and you can see some of the marker lines. I will be putting on a second coat, but I'm going to do that after I'm finished coloring in all of my images. I love this combination for red roses. I'm working with darkest to lightest, R89, 39, 35, and 32. As I approach the coloring for each flower, I pay close attention to the shape of the petals. As I color each flower, I categorize the petals as either open cup or deep cup. Open cup are the outer petals and they curl away from the flower. I Copic color darkest to lightest, so that needs to be kept in mind as I describe my process. For the open petals, I color with my darkest marker on the inside edge first, so that is R89, and then I work up towards the petal's edge using R39, 35, and finishing off with a thin band of R32. I'm just noticing that I'm using R37 instead of 39, but I do switch it out because I ran out of ink. To get a nice smooth blend, I do a second coat, but I start with the R37 in this case, but for most of the flower petals, it's R39. This tiny petal that I'm working on now is a good example of a deep cup where the petal is standing more upright. For this style of petal, the darkest tone starts on the outside edge of the petal, working towards the inside with the lighter tones, opposite to that of an open cup petal. Here's another example of coloring an open petal. I start on the inside edge with my darkest tone, which is the R89, and then I introduce the next tone, which is R39. Typically, I would have more R89, which is the deepest tone, but I ended up switching over to the R39 because the petal next to it had a line of that R89 and I didn't want those two petals to blend together. Paying attention to the petals that are next to the one that you're coloring are important so that a distinction can be maintained. And on goes the second coat of R32 to finish this petal off. The deep cup petals tend to be closer to the flower center. These petals are usually smaller. I'm working on 3 at once. I've started off with my deep tone right at the base of the petal and then work upwards to the top edge with the lighter tones, finishing off with a thin band of R32. The deep cup petal that I'm working on now borders right up against another open cup petal. The dark edge for the open petal is R89, so I'm going to start coloring the deep cup petal with the next darkest tone, which is the R39. This will keep both petals distinct. The different approaches used to color the deep cup and open cup petals summarizes how the entire rose has been colored. The leaves are colored simply using a combination of BG99, G99, G94, and G82. I begin with my darkest tone, which is BG99, in the center at the base of the leaf. For each tone, I use a flicking motion starting at the center and working towards the outside edge. When the G82, which is the lightest tone, is applied to the leaf's edge, I use tiny circular motions. This will saturate the ink, causing those two greens to blend together. Mentioned earlier in this video that the negative space of this panel was colored with a black marker, 100. After one coat, the marker lines were visible, so I'm applying a second coat and I'm making sure that I'm applying it all in the same direction. I have to say that I was pretty impressed when I was finished. Not sure why it took me so long, but I only recently invested in this marker. In the past, if I wanted to create a black background for my Copic coloring, I used a Sharpie. And believe me, it was far from perfect no matter how many coats I put on. Adding 100 black to my collection was long overdue. The sentiment for this card has been hot foiled with gold foil on black cardstock. I'm using a beautiful foiling plate by Pink Fresh Studios called Best Wishes. The platform from the hot foil system replaces the one from the die cutting machine and it is slowly rolled through forwards and backwards. This is a nice size sentiment with a beautiful script. This hot foil plate has an accompanying die. I remove the hot foil platform and replace it back with the die cutter's platform. Once I have the die lined up over the sentiment, I like to use a little bit of Post-it note tape to ensure that it doesn't shift as it's going through the die cutter. This die is also used to die cut some black sheet foam. When die cutting foam, I only run it in one direction so it doesn't stretch out too much. The foiled cardstock sentiment is stacked on the foam die cut. The panel is adhered to a top folding landscape-oriented card base that measures 4 1/4 inches by 5 1/2 inches. Typically, I use a heavier cardstock for my card bases. I'm using Neenah Classic Crest 110 pound. After the beautiful sentiment has been adhered, I highlight it with some gold confetti. The mix that I'm using is really shiny and beautiful by Studio Kasha called Gold Fever. Once I figured out how the confetti is going to be positioned on the panel, I glue it down and I of course top it up with Nouveau Crystal Drops Morning Dew. I know, if I didn't do this, you'd be wondering who was making the card in the video. And that wraps up this card featuring Alex Syberia Designs Roses Frame. This gorgeous image can be found at Alex Syberia Designs Etsy shop. If you are viewing on YouTube, a link can be found in the description of this video. Thank you so much for joining me, and as always, I appreciate your visit.